The end of World War II brought hope for a more prosperous future. From the ashes of conflict emerged a new global order. At its heart were two powerful institutions, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank. Created in 1944, their mission was to rebuild war-torn economies and foster international financial stability. These institutions, headquartered in Washington, D.C., would soon extend their reach to every corner of the world, including the African continent. The IMF and World Bank promised a path to development for newly independent African nations. Loans were offered to support infrastructure projects, healthcare systems, and education initiatives. On the surface, these loans seemed like a lifeline, a way for African countries to catch up to the developed world. However, this promise of progress came at a steep price, one that continues to haunt many African nations today. The legacy of colonialism had left many African countries with underdeveloped economies and weak institutions. The IMF and World Bank, with their Western-centric worldview and policies, often failed to consider the unique challenges facing the continent. This essay will argue that these institutions, instead of fostering sustainable development, have trapped many African nations in a cycle of debt and dependency. Structural adjustment programs imposed by the IMF and World Bank often demanded severe austerity measures. These measures led to the closure of schools and hospitals, deteriorating public services, and increased poverty. The exploitation of African labor and resources intensified, perpetuating a form of neo-colonialism. Many African leaders and activists have spoken out against this modern-day exploitation, calling for a fairer and more just economic system. Despite these challenges, African nations continue to strive for true independence and sustainable development, driven by the resilience and innovation of their people. The loans provided by the IMF and World Bank were not simply acts of charity. They came with strings attached, often in the form of strict conditions known as conditionalities. These conditionalities required borrowing countries to implement specific economic policies in exchange for financial assistance. In the 1980s and 90s, these policies often took the form of structural adjustment programs, or SAPs. SAPs advocated for a neoliberal economic model emphasizing privatization, deregulation, and trade liberalization. Countries were pressured to cut government spending, devalue their currencies, and reduce import barriers. While these policies were presented as a recipe for economic growth, they often had devastating social consequences. Cuts to public spending led to the deterioration of essential services like healthcare and education. Privatization resulted in job losses and increased costs for basic utilities. The removal of trade barriers flooded local markets with cheap imports, undermining domestic industries. These policies, far from fostering sustainable development, exacerbated poverty and inequality in many African nations. The high interest rates on these loans created a debt spiral, making it nearly impossible for countries to repay their debts. As debts accumulated, countries were forced to take out new loans to service old ones, trapping them in a cycle of dependency. Critics argue that this system amounts to a form of neo-colonialism, where financial institutions exert control over the economic policies of sovereign nations. The exploitation and control by these financial institutions have sparked calls for a new approach to international development, one that prioritizes the needs and aspirations of African nations. One of the most insidious aspects of IMF and World Bank lending is the use of high interest rates. While these institutions may offer concessional loans with lower interest rates to some countries, many African nations are forced to borrow at commercial rates, significantly increasing their debt burden. This is compounded by the fact that loans are often denominated in foreign currencies, leaving countries vulnerable to fluctuations in exchange rates. As interest payments accumulate, countries are forced to divert scarce resources away from essential services and development projects. This creates a vicious cycle of debt where countries are forced to borrow more money simply to service their existing debts. This debt trap severely limits the ability of African governments to invest in their people and build a more prosperous future. The high interest rates charged by the IMF and World Bank are not simply a matter of economic policy. They reflect a power dynamic that favors lenders over borrowers. These institutions, dominated by Western countries, have the ability to impose their economic will on developing nations. This raises serious questions about the fairness and justice of the global financial system. The policies enforced by the IMF and World Bank often lead to austerity measures that exacerbate poverty and inequality. Local economies are stifled as governments are pressured to cut public spending and privatize essential services. This form of economic exploitation is often seen as a modern form of neocolonialism, where financial control replaces direct political control. There is a growing call for the cancellation of these unjust debts and for a reformation of the global financial system to ensure fairness and equity for all nations.